Mom went shopping and never returned. 14 years later, her family unlocks a heartbreaking truth. Before we begin, drop a comment below to tell us where you're watching from. If you believe the truth always comes out, like and subscribe. Now sit back and enjoy the story. Melissa's fingers hovered above the lid of the shoebox, hesitating. The attic seemed to grow quieter, as if the house itself was holding its breath. Finally, she lifted the lid, revealing a jumble of old photographs, letters, and trinkets. Fragments of a life frozen in time. As she sifted through the contents, one photograph slipped from the pile and landed face up on her lap. It showed Melissa at 8 years old, covered in flour up to her elbows, grinning ear to ear next to Claire, who held a tray of cookie dough with an indulgent smile. The memory came rushing back, vivid and warm. The kitchen smelled like vanilla and butter, sunlight streaming through the windows as golden dust motes swirled lazily in the air. Young Melissa stood on a wobbly stool beside the counter, trying and failing to pour flour into a measuring cup without spilling it everywhere. "Careful," Claire said gently, her hands guiding Melissa's. "You don't want too much or your cookies will turn into hockey pucks." Melissa giggled, sneaking a finger into the bowl to swipe some raw dough. Claire caught her hand mid-theft and raised an eyebrow. "Oh, no, you don't. You'll ruin your appetite." "But they smell so good," Melissa protested, pouting for effect. Claire laughed, ruffling her hair before sliding the tray into the oven. The warmth radiating from the stove matched the comfort Melissa felt whenever she was with her mother. "Hey, Mom," Melissa asked after a moment, leaning against the counter, "can we go on vacation someday, like to the beach or something?" Claire froze for just a second, her back to Melissa as she wiped her hands on a dish towel. When she turned around, her smile was softer, tinged with sadness. "Someday, when things are better," she said quietly, "we'll make it happen, I promise." Melissa didn't fully understand what "when things are better" meant, but she nodded anyway, trusting her mother implicitly. To her young mind, promises were sacred. They always came true. Another item in the box caught Melissa's eye, a crumpled piece of notebook paper, yellowed with age. Unfolding it, she recognized her father's handwriting. "We need to talk about this, now." Her stomach tightened. She remembered the fights, the sharp voices behind closed doors, the way her parents tried to shield her, but couldn't quite hide the tension. It was late at night, long after Melissa should have been asleep. She lay in bed, clutching her stuffed bear tightly as muffled voices drifted down the hallway. They weren't yelling, not yet, but there was an edge to their words that made her heart race. "I can't keep doing this, Dan," Claire whispered urgently. "We're drowning here. There has to be another way." Dan's voice was low and frustrated. "What do you expect me to do, Claire? Wave a magic wand? We're barely keeping the lights on as it is." Melissa crept out of bed, tiptoeing to the cracked door of her room. She peeked through the gap, seeing her parents sitting at the kitchen table. Papers were scattered across the surface, bills mostly, along with bank statements marked in red ink. Claire rested her head in her hands, looking so tired that Melissa hardly recognized her. The argument escalated quickly, though neither raised their voice above a harsh whisper. Words like loan, deadline, and impossible floated through the air, heavy with meaning Melissa didn't fully grasp. Eventually, Dan stormed out of the room, leaving Claire alone at the table. Later that night, after everything had gone quiet, Claire tucked Melissa back into bed. Melissa looked up at her, wide-eyed. "Are you mad at Dad?" she asked softly. Claire sighed, brushing a strand of hair from Melissa's face. "No, sweetheart. It's complicated. Grown-up stuff. But I promise, no matter what happens, I'll always take care of you." Her words were meant to reassure, but even then, Melissa sensed the weight behind them. The unspoken fear that maybe, someday, Claire wouldn't be able to keep that promise. Melissa blinked back tears, folding the crumpled note and placing it carefully back in the box. Each memory unearthed more questions than answers. What had Claire been so afraid of? Why had she hesitated when Melissa asked about vacations? And most importantly, why had she left? And where had she gone? Her gaze fell on another object in the box, a small leather-bound journal with a broken clasp. Its pages were filled with Claire's neat handwriting. Melissa's breath caught. This wasn't just a collection of odds and ends. It was a window into her mother's world, one she hadn't known existed. With trembling hands, she opened the journal. Melissa's fingers hesitated over the journal, her mind still reeling from the fragments of memory unearthed in the attic. But as she flipped through its pages, she found herself drawn not just to her mother's words, but also to the stark contrast between the warmth of those memories and the cold reality that followed Claire's disappearance. The journal entries stopped abruptly weeks before her mother vanished, leaving Melissa with more questions than answers. She closed the book gently, setting it aside for now, and let her thoughts drift back to the days immediately after Claire went missing. The chaos, the fear, the way their small Wisconsin town had rallied around them. The days following Claire's disappearance felt like a blur of flashing lights, hushed conversations, and tear-streaked faces. Flyers bearing her smiling photograph appeared overnight, plastering every storefront, telephone pole, and community bulletin board in town. Missing Claire Simmons, they read in bold letters beneath her name. Beneath that, smaller text pleaded, "If you have any information, please call." Neighbors who had only ever exchanged polite waves with the Simmons family suddenly became fixtures in their home. Casseroles filled the fridge, unsolicited advice poured in, and volunteers gathered daily at the local church to organize search parties. Armed with flashlights and binoculars, they combed through fields, woods, and abandoned buildings, calling out Claire's name until their voices grew hoarse. For Melissa, then just 12 years old, it was overwhelming. Strangers hugged her, telling her how sorry they were, while others whispered behind cupped hands about what might have happened. She clung to her father, Dan, desperate for some semblance of normalcy, but even he seemed distant, his usual gruff demeanor replaced by something darker, heavier. It didn't take long for suspicion to creep into the narrative. Neighbors began recounting late-night arguments they'd overheard coming from the Simmons household. Mrs. Peterson from across the street mentioned seeing Dan pacing angrily in the driveway one evening. Mr. Hargrove, who lived 2 doors down, claimed he'd heard raised voices the night before Claire disappeared. Detectives questioned Dan multiple times, probing into his alibi and motives. He cooperated fully, his face pale and drawn as he recounted his whereabouts, working late at the factory, stopping for gas on the way home. Receipts corroborated his story, and ultimately, there was no evidence tying him to Claire's disappearance. Still, the damage was done. The whispers lingered, growing louder despite the lack of proof. Some people avoided Dan altogether, crossing the street when they saw him coming. Others offered sympathetic smiles that didn't quite reach their eyes. Even within their own family, cracks began to form. Melissa noticed how Dan stopped talking about Claire altogether, retreating into himself instead of confronting the pain head-on. At night, Melissa would lie awake in bed, listening to the muffled sounds of bottles clinking together in the kitchen. When she crept downstairs once, she found Dan sitting alone at the table, staring blankly at a glass of whiskey. His eyes were bloodshot, his jaw clenched tight. For a moment, she thought about asking him if he knew where Mom was, but something stopped her. The look on his face wasn't grief or guilt. It was something else entirely. Defeat, maybe, or regret. Back in the present, Melissa shook her head, trying to dispel the weight of those memories. The attic felt suffocating now, the walls closing in around her. She stood abruptly, brushing dust off her jeans, and carried the shoebox downstairs. Her father was gone. A stroke had taken him 5 years ago, but his absence still loomed large over this house. And yet, as much as Melissa resented him for shutting her out during the hardest time of her life, she couldn't shake the feeling that he'd been hiding something too. Something important. She set the box down on the dining room table, flipping it open again. Among the photographs and trinkets lay another item she hadn't noticed before. A folded map of Wisconsin, marked with red X's in several locations. Written in Claire's handwriting along the edges were cryptic notes. Old Miller Farm, ask about storage, Surrey, Lakeview Cabin, check lease records, and Dad's shed, locked since '98. Melissa's heart raced. This wasn't random scribbling. It was deliberate. Her mother had been planning something, mapping out places of interest before she vanished. Whatever secrets Claire had kept, they weren't buried with her. They were waiting to be uncovered. Melissa stared at the map spread out on the dining table, her mind racing. Each red X marked a potential clue, a breadcrumb left behind by her mother that no one, not the police, not her father, not even Melissa herself, had ever found. It was as though Claire had been planning something, or perhaps running from something. But before she could fully process what the map might mean, her eyes drifted back to the shoebox sitting beside it. She'd already gone through most of its contents: a journal, faded photographs, trinkets. But there was one last item tucked into the very bottom, wrapped in yellowed tissue paper. Something about it felt different, heavier somehow, like it didn't belong with the rest. With trembling hands, Melissa unwrapped the tissue paper. Inside was a single photograph, slightly creased but otherwise intact. Her breath caught in her throat. It was Claire. She stood in the middle of a park, arms crossed casually over her chest, laughing as sunlight filtered through the trees around her. Melissa's heart pounded as she flipped the photo over. Scrawled on the back in Claire's unmistakable handwriting were two words and a date: Lakeview Park, summer 2012. 3 years after Claire disappeared. The room seemed to tilt beneath Melissa's feet. Her mind scrambled to make sense of what she was seeing. This wasn't possible. Everyone had searched for Claire. Friends, family, volunteers, detectives. Flyers plastered every surface for months. How could she have been alive 3 years later? Why hadn't she come home? And then another thought struck her, colder and sharper. If Claire was alive in 2012, where was she now? Her fingers tightened around the edges of the photograph, the weight of it pressing down on her chest. For 15 years, she'd believed her mother was gone forever, lost to some unspeakable fate. But this changed everything. Claire hadn't just vanished, she'd chosen to leave. Or maybe she'd been forced to. Melissa's gaze darted back to the map, her pulse quickening. One of the red X's was labeled Lakeview Cabin. Could this be connected? Had Claire left clues for her to follow all along? 1,000 questions swirled in her mind, each more urgent than the last. She grabbed the map and folded it carefully, tucking it into her bag along with the photograph. Whatever answers lay hidden in these fragments of her mother's past, Melissa knew one thing for certain. She wasn't going to stop until she found them. As Melissa stepped outside, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the yard, she glanced back at the house one last time. The attic window stared down at her like an unblinking eye, guarding decades of secrets within its dusty walls. She took a deep breath, clutching her bag tightly, and whispered under her breath, "I'm coming, Mom." Then she turned and walked toward her car, determination etched into every line of her face. Somewhere out there, Claire Simmons was waiting, and Melissa would move heaven and earth to find her. Melissa had spent the last week poring over the map and the photograph from her mother's shoebox, trying to piece together a plan. She'd marked each red X on the map with sticky notes, jotting down possible locations and what they might mean. But despite her efforts, she was no closer to understanding why Claire had disappeared, or where she might be now. It was late afternoon when Melissa returned home after another fruitless trip to the library, hoping to dig up old newspaper archives about Lakeview Cabin. As she climbed the porch steps, something caught her eye: a plain brown envelope sitting on the doormat. Her heart skipped a beat. There was no return address, no stamp, just her name scrawled across the front in neat block letters. Someone had hand-delivered it. With shaking hands, Melissa tore open the envelope. Inside were two items: an antique key, brass, tarnished with age, its teeth oddly intricate. It looked like it belonged to an old lockbox, or maybe even a door long forgotten. A Polaroid photograph, showing Claire standing outside a diner in what appeared to be rural Minnesota. In the background, a faded sign read, "Mabel's Diner." Her mother wore a denim jacket and jeans, smiling faintly at the camera. Across the bottom of the photo, written in ink, were the words, "Mabel's Diner, summer 2012. The date matched the one on the park photo Melissa had found earlier. This wasn't just a random snapshot. It was proof that Claire had been alive years after everyone thought she was gone. But who had sent this? And why? Melissa sank onto the couch, staring at the Polaroid as memories flooded back. She remembered how much her mother loved road trips, how she'd always talked about visiting small towns and diners off the beaten path. One summer when Melissa was 10, they'd driven for hours just to eat pie at a roadside cafe Claire swore served the best peach cobbler in the Midwest. Claire would joke about these places being her secret hideaways, spots where she could disappear for a day and forget about all her worries. At the time, Melissa hadn't understood what those worries were, but now looking at the photo, she wondered if her mother had taken that idea literally. What if Claire had disappeared, not because she wanted to leave her family behind, but because she was running from something or someone? Determined to get answers, Melissa decided to start with the most obvious lead, Mabel's Diner. If Claire had been there in 2012, someone might remember her. Maybe the staff, maybe regular patrons, anyone who could provide a clue about where she went next. She packed a bag with essentials, including the map, the photos, and the mysterious key. Before leaving, she paused in front of the mirror in her bedroom, studying her reflection. For so many years, she'd felt powerless, stuck in the shadow of her mother's disappearance. But now, for the first time, she felt a spark of hope and purpose. "I'll find you, Mom," she whispered to herself. "I promise." The drive to Minnesota took nearly 8 hours, but Melissa barely noticed the time passing. Her mind buzzed with questions. Who had sent the envelope? Was it Claire herself, reaching out from wherever she was hiding? Or was it someone else? Someone who knew more than they were letting on? When she finally arrived in the tiny town where Mabel's Diner was located, she felt a pang of unease. The streets were eerily quiet, lined with weathered buildings and flickering streetlights. The diner itself looked almost exactly as it did in the Polaroid, though the paint was peeling and the neon sign above the door blinked erratically. Inside, the air smelled of burnt coffee and fried food. A few customers sat scattered around the room, nursing cups of coffee or picking at plates of greasy fries. Behind the counter stood an older woman with silver hair pulled into a tight bun. She glanced up as Melissa approached, her sharp eyes narrowing slightly. "Can I help you?" the woman asked, her tone polite but guarded. Melissa pulled out the Polaroid and slid it across the counter. "Do you recognize this woman? She was here in 2012. The woman froze, her expression shifting from curiosity to something darker. Fear, maybe, or guilt. For a long moment, she said nothing, simply staring at the photo. Then, without a word, she turned and walked toward the back of the diner, disappearing through a swinging door. Melissa hesitated, unsure whether to follow her or wait. Before she could decide, the woman reappeared, holding something in her hand. It was a small wooden box, locked with an antique brass keyhole. "This is the woman said quietly, placing the box on the counter. "Your mom left it here. Said someday you'd come looking for it." Melissa stared at the box, her pulse racing. The key in her pocket suddenly felt heavier, its purpose clear. Whatever was inside, it had been meant for her, for this exact moment. As she reached for the box, the woman leaned closer, lowering her voice. "Be careful, sweetheart. Some secrets. They don't stay buried forever." Melissa's hands trembled as she held the small wooden box, still locked, its secrets tantalizingly out of reach. She hadn't yet inserted the antique key, unsure if she was ready to face whatever lay inside. The diner's fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the room. The silence between her and the silver-haired waitress stretched thin, heavy with unspoken truths. Before Melissa could ask another question, the bell above the door jingled, announcing a new arrival. An older man stepped in, his weathered face framed by thick glasses and a scruffy beard. He wore a threadbare leather jacket over a flannel shirt, and his gait suggested someone who'd spent decades chasing stories rather than rest. "Earl Jensen," he introduced himself, extending a hand toward Melissa. His voice carried the gravelly tone of cigarettes and late nights. "I think we need to talk." Melissa frowned, glancing at the waitress for confirmation. The woman nodded almost imperceptibly before retreating to the kitchen, leaving them alone. "I covered your mother's disappearance back in '09, Earl continued, sliding into the booth across from her. "Wrote a few pieces for the local paper. Didn't do much good, though." There was a flicker of regret in his eyes, a weight he clearly carried even after all these years. "I've been following this case ever since. When I heard you were asking questions," he trailed off, shrugging slightly, "figured it was time I made things right." Melissa studied him cautiously. Something about his demeanor, earnest but weary, made her want to trust him. Still, she wasn't about to let her guard down completely. Not yet. "What kind of leads are you talking about?" she asked, her voice steady despite the storm brewing inside her. Earl leaned forward, pulling a battered notebook from his jacket pocket. "Let's start with the basics. Your mom didn't just vanish into thin air. She left a trail. A faint one, sure, but it's there if you know where to look." ATM records. Earl flipped open his notebook, revealing pages filled with scribbled notes and photocopies of documents. "A few months ago, I dug up some old bank records. Turns out Claire withdrew $500 in cash hours after she disappeared. Used an ATM near the edge of town. No security cameras, unfortunately, so no footage. But that tells us two things. One, she had access to money, and two, she planned ahead." Melissa's stomach churned. Her mother had always been meticulous when it came to finances. $500 wasn't an amount she'd withdraw on a whim. Whatever Claire had done, it hadn't been spontaneous. P.O. Box rental. "Then there's this," Earl said, sliding a grainy photocopy across the table. It was a rental agreement for a post office box under the name C. Whitaker, dated several months after Claire's disappearance. The address? Duluth, Minnesota, a city less than 3 hours away from where they sat now. "C. Whitaker?" Melissa echoed, furrowing her brow. "That doesn't make sense. My mom's name was Claire Simmons." "Alias," Earl replied simply. "People use fake names for all sorts of reasons. Maybe she was hiding, or maybe she didn't want anyone finding her. Either way, it's a lead." Wedding ring discovery. Finally, Earl pulled out a crumpled newspaper clipping. The headline read, "Lost and Found. Sentimental items turn up at local thrift shop." Beneath it was a photo of miscellaneous jewelry, including a simple gold band with tiny diamonds. Melissa's breath hitched. She recognized it instantly. That ring had been her parents' wedding band, a gift from Dan to Claire on their 5th anniversary. They'd fought bitterly over finances in the months leading up to Claire's disappearance. But Melissa couldn't imagine her mother parting with something so meaningful unless she absolutely had to. "It showed up at a thrift shop in Iowa last year," Earl explained. "Owner didn't think much of it until I started poking around. Bought it off him for $50. Figured it might be important." Melissa reached out, taking the clipping gently. Her mind raced. Why would Claire leave behind something so personal? Had she sold it out of desperation, or discarded it deliberately? As Melissa absorbed the new information, Earl watched her carefully, gauging her reaction. "Listen," he said finally, his tone softer. "I don't have all the answers. Hell, I barely have any. But one thing I do know is that your mom didn't disappear because she wanted to abandon you. She left because she thought it was the only way to keep you safe." "Safe from what?" Melissa demanded, her voice cracking under the weight of emotion. Earl hesitated, rubbing a hand over his stubbled chin. "That's what we're going to find out." He gestured toward the wooden box on the table. "You should open that. Whatever's inside, it's probably the next piece of the puzzle." Melissa stared at the box, her heart pounding. She slipped the antique key from her pocket and turned it over in her fingers. This moment felt monumental, like stepping through a doorway she couldn't close behind her. With a deep breath, she inserted the key into the lock and twisted. The lid creaked open, revealing a bundle of yellowed letters tied with twine, a folded map marked with unfamiliar locations, and a single cassette tape labeled in Claire's handwriting, "For Melissa. Listen carefully." Melissa froze, her pulse thundering in her ears. Whatever secrets Claire had kept hidden for 15 years, they were about to come spilling out, and nothing would ever be the same again. Melissa's journey to uncover the truth about her mother was growing more complex and more dangerous with each new discovery. As she delved deeper into Claire's trail, she couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching her every move. The next morning, armed with Earl's information about the wedding ring, Melissa drove to the small Iowa town where the thrift shop was located. It was a quaint little place tucked between a hardware store and a diner, its windows cluttered with mismatched mannequins and vintage signs. Inside, the air smelled faintly of mothballs and old wood, rows of shelves crammed with forgotten treasures. She approached the counter, showing the clerk a photo of the ring from Earl's newspaper clipping. "This was sold here recently," she said, keeping her tone casual. Do you remember who brought it in? The clerk, an elderly woman with wiry glasses perched on her nose, squinted at the photo before shaking her head. Sorry, honey. We get so much stuff through here, it's hard to keep track. But, she paused, tapping her chin thoughtfully. There was a guy, a drifter maybe? Came in a few times selling jewelry. Seemed nervous, like he didn't want to be seen. Melissa pressed for more details, but the clerk couldn't recall anything specific, just that the man had worn a dark hoodie and kept his face mostly hidden. Frustrated but undeterred, Melissa wandered the aisles, scanning the shelves as if hoping some clue might leap out at her. What she didn't notice was the figure standing outside the shop window, partially obscured by the glare of sunlight on glass. A man in a dark hoodie watched her intently, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. When she turned toward the door, he quickly stepped back into the shadows of an alleyway, disappearing before she could catch sight of him. That night, back at the motel where she was staying, Melissa sat cross-legged on the bed, poring over the contents of the wooden box. The yellowed letters were addressed to her, written in Claire's neat handwriting but never sent. They spoke of love, regret, and cryptic warnings. Stay away from Lakeview Cabin. Trust no one, not even those closest to you. The folded map showed unfamiliar locations marked with red circles, none of which matched the ones on the map Claire had left behind years ago. And then there was the cassette tape, its label taunting her with its promise of answers. Before she could work up the courage to listen to it, her phone rang. Startled, she glanced at the screen. It was an unknown number. Her heart raced as she answered cautiously. Hello? She said, her voice trembling slightly. Silence greeted her on the other end. No breathing, no static, just an empty void. After several seconds, the line went dead. Her stomach churned. Was it a wrong number, or something more sinister? It happened again later that night, and then once more the following evening. Each time, the same eerie silence. Whoever was calling didn't speak, but the timing felt deliberate, as though they knew exactly when Melissa would be most vulnerable. By the third night, Melissa was on edge. Every creak of the motel floorboards, every flicker of the bedside lamp, made her jump. She double-checked the locks on the door and pulled the curtains shut tightly, though she couldn't shake the feeling that eyes were still watching her from somewhere beyond the glass. Earl called around midnight to check in. You okay? He asked gruffly. You sound like you've seen a ghost. I don't know what's going on, Melissa admitted, lowering her voice, but I think someone's following me. First at the thrift shop, now these weird phone calls. Earl cursed under his breath. Listen, kid, this case has always had layers we didn't understand. If someone doesn't want you poking around, they'll try to scare you off. Don't let them. His words did little to reassure her. Still, she forced herself to focus. Whatever, or whoever, was behind this, she couldn't afford to lose her nerve now. Not when she was so close to finding her mother. Finally, unable to delay any longer, Melissa inserted the cassette tape into an old player she'd borrowed from the motel office. With bated breath, she pressed play. At first, there was only static, faint crackling sounds filling the room. Then suddenly, Claire's voice emerged, soft but urgent. Melissa, sweetheart, if you're hearing this, it means I'm not there to protect you anymore. There are things I should have told you long ago, but I was afraid for your safety, afraid of what they might do to us both. Her voice broke, and Melissa clutched the edge of the bed, tears streaming down her face. They know too much, Mel. About me, about our family. I tried to leave quietly, to keep you safe, but I don't know how long I can stay ahead of them. If anything happens to me, go to Mabel's diner. Ask for Ruth. She'll help you find the truth. But be careful. Trust no one else, not even Dad. The recording ended abruptly, leaving Melissa staring at the tape player in stunned silence. Who were they? What did her mother know that had put her in such danger? And why hadn't Claire trusted Dan enough to confide in him? As Melissa replayed the tape, trying to catch every nuance of Claire's warning, she failed to notice the shadow moving past her window. Whoever it was lingered just long enough to peer inside before vanishing into the darkness. Whoever was watching her wasn't done yet. The cassette tape replayed in Melissa's mind as she drove back to Minnesota, the pieces of her mother's story slowly coming together. Claire's voice haunted her, the urgency, the fear, the love that bled through every word. But one question burned brighter than all the others. Why hadn't Claire contacted her? Melissa couldn't reconcile the image of her vibrant, loving mother with the idea of a woman who would willingly cut ties with her own children. Something, or someone, had forced Claire into hiding, and now Melissa was determined to uncover the truth. When Melissa returned to Mabel's diner, Ruth, the silver-haired waitress who had given her the wooden box, was waiting. This time, there was no pretense. Ruth gestured for Melissa to follow her into the kitchen, away from prying ears. "You're Claire's girl," Ruth said quietly, studying Melissa's face as though searching for traces of her mother. "I knew it the moment I saw you." Melissa nodded, clutching the Polaroid and the cassette tape tightly. "My mom, she left this place for me. Said you'd help." Ruth sighed heavily, leaning against the counter. "Your mom wasn't just passing through, sweetheart. She stayed here for years. Changed her name to Clara Whitaker, kept to herself, worked odd jobs, lived quietly, tried to disappear." Melissa's breath caught. "But why? Why didn't she come home? Why didn't she at least call us?" Ruth hesitated, her expression pained. "She wanted to, more than anything. But she was scared. Scared they'd find her. Scared they'd hurt you and your brother." "They?" Melissa pressed, her voice trembling. "Who are they?" Ruth shook her head. "I don't know everything, but your mom trusted me enough to share bits and pieces. She talked about people watching her, following her, men in suits asking questions. She thought your dad might have been involved somehow, or at least that he knew more than he let on." Melissa's stomach churned. Her father had always been distant after Claire disappeared, retreating into himself and drowning his sorrows in whiskey. Could he have known where Claire was all along? Melissa's mind flashed back to scattered memories of arguments between her parents. Claire whispering, "It's complicated, sweetheart." Dan storming out of the house after heated fights. The way he avoided talking about Claire entirely once she was gone. Had he lied to her? To everyone? Ruth continued, pulling an old photo album from beneath the counter. Inside were snapshots of Claire, now going by Clara, working at the diner, tending a small garden behind a modest rental house, smiling faintly as she walked along the lakeshore. In some photos, she looked happy, almost peaceful. In others, her eyes carried a sadness that chilled Melissa to the bone. "She never stopped thinking about you," Ruth said softly. "She used to talk about you all the time, about how much she missed baking cookies with you, how proud she was of the young woman you were becoming. But she believed staying away was the only way to keep you safe." Melissa stared at the photos, her chest tightening. For so long, she'd thought her mother abandoned them. But now, seeing evidence of Claire's quiet life, a life built around protecting her family, it broke her heart in a different way. "She must have been terrified," Melissa murmured, tracing the edge of one photo. "To live like that." "She was," Ruth confirmed. "But she also fought hard to stay alive, kept moving, changed identities when she had to, always looking over her shoulder." As Melissa flipped through the album, one particular photo caught her eye. It showed Claire standing outside a post office in Duluth, the same P.O. box Earl had mentioned. Tucked under her arm was a manila envelope, its contents bulging slightly. "Do you know what she was doing there?" Melissa asked, pointing to the photo. Ruth frowned, leaning closer. "No, but she came here once, upset. Said someone had sent her something. Not a letter, but documents, important ones. She wouldn't tell me what they were, but whatever it was, it made her leave town overnight." Melissa's pulse quickened. Documents. Whoever was threatening Claire, and possibly her family, might have left a paper trail. If she could track down those files, she might finally understand what drove her mother into hiding. Before leaving the diner, Ruth handed Melissa a slip of paper with an address scribbled on it. "This is where she lived last I heard. Might not be much use now. It's been years. But maybe you'll find something." Melissa thanked her and turned to go, but Ruth grabbed her wrist gently. "Be careful, okay? Whoever scared your mom enough to fake her death, they're still out there." As Melissa stepped outside, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the parking lot, She felt the weight of Ruth's warning settle over her. She glanced around instinctively, half expecting to see the figure in the hoodie again. The street was empty, but the feeling of being watched lingered. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. A text message from an unknown number. Just 3 words. Stop digging. Melissa stared at the screen, her blood running cold. Whoever was behind this wasn't just watching. They were warning her. But she wasn't about to stop. Not now. Not when she was closer than ever to finding her mother. With trembling hands, she saved the address Ruth had given her and climbed into her car. The road ahead was uncertain, fraught with danger. But one thing was clear. Claire Simmons hadn't vanished willingly. She'd been running, and Melissa was determined to finish what her mother started. Melissa's journey led her to Duluth, a city nestled along the shores of Lake Superior. The air was crisp, tinged with the scent of pine and water, but Melissa barely noticed. Her focus was razor-sharp as she navigated the narrow streets, following the address Ruth had given her. The storage facility was tucked away in an industrial part of town, surrounded by warehouses and chain-link fences topped with barbed wire. It felt eerily quiet, save for the distant hum of machinery and the occasional squawk of seagulls overhead. Melissa parked her car near the entrance and approached the gatehouse, clutching the antique key tightly in her hand. After confirming the unit number with the attendant, a disinterested young man scrolling through his phone, she drove around to a row of weathered metal lockers. Unit number 37 sat at the end of the aisle, its faded blue door bearing years of rust and scratches. Melissa hesitated for a moment, staring at the padlock that guarded whatever secrets lay inside. With a deep breath, she inserted the key and turned it. The lock clicked open, echoing faintly in the stillness. The space wasn't large, but it was packed with items meticulously organized into boxes and bins. Each container bore labels written in Claire's neat handwriting. Photos, documents, journals. Melissa's heart raced as she pulled out the first box marked Journals and opened it carefully. Inside were several leather-bound notebooks, their pages filled with Claire's familiar script. As Melissa flipped through them, a wave of emotions crashed over her. Anger, grief, relief, all tangled together as the truth about her mother's life began to unfold. June 14th, 2006. Dan yelled again tonight. Over something so small, I forgot to take the laundry out of the dryer. He doesn't hit me, not physically anyway, but his words cut deeper than any fist ever could. I hate the way he looks at me sometimes, like I'm nothing more than a burden. I try to shield Melissa and Jake from it, but I know they hear us fighting. They're too young to understand, but old enough to feel it. Melissa's hands trembled as she read on, tears blurring the ink on the page. She'd known her parents argued often, but she'd never imagined the extent of her father's cruelty or her mother's suffering. March 3rd, 2008. Today, Dan accused me of flirting with the mailman because I smiled when he handed me a package. His jealousy is suffocating, and it's getting worse. What scares me most is what he might do if he loses control completely. I can handle his anger, but I won't let him hurt my babies. Not Melissa, not Jake. If I have to leave to keep them safe, I will. Melissa wiped her eyes, her chest tightening. For years, she'd blamed herself for her mother's disappearance, wondered if she'd done something wrong, if Claire had left because she couldn't handle being a mom anymore. But now she understood the heartbreaking reality. Claire hadn't abandoned them. She'd sacrificed everything to protect them. September 12th, 2009. I've been planning this for months. Fake IDs, new names, bank accounts under aliases. Everything I'll need to disappear. Tomorrow is Melissa's birthday. I promised her we'd bake cookies together, and I intend to keep that promise. Afterward, while she's distracted opening presents, I'll slip away. I'll tell her goodbye somehow, if only I can find the right words. But how do you explain to your child that leaving is the only way to save her? Melissa clutched the journal to her chest, overcome with emotion. This was why Claire had gone, to shield her family from Dan's wrath, even if it meant giving up her own happiness. And yet, despite everything, she'd continued to fight for them, finding ways to stay connected from afar. In addition to the journals, the locker contained countless photographs and mementos, snapshots of Melissa and Jake growing up, school reports, drawings they'd made for Claire as kids. There were also letters Claire had written but never sent, addressed to her children and filled with apologies, love, and hope. One item stood out among the rest, a small wooden frame holding a picture of Claire, Melissa, and Jake at a park picnic. On the back, Claire had scrawled a single sentence: "My greatest joy, my biggest regret, my eternal love." Melissa traced the glass with trembling fingers, her vision blurred by tears. For so long, she'd believed her mother chose freedom over family. Now she realized the opposite was true. Claire had chosen survival, for all of them. As Melissa packed the journals and photos back into the boxes, a realization settled over her like a heavy blanket. Her father wasn't just emotionally abusive, he was dangerous. Claire's fears weren't unfounded. Dan's controlling behavior had driven her to extremes. Even after Claire disappeared, his drinking and withdrawal had shaped Melissa's childhood, leaving scars she was only beginning to recognize. But there was no time to dwell on the past. Whoever had been watching her, the shadowy figure in the hoodie, the silent phone calls, they were still out there. And Melissa knew she couldn't face them alone. She reached for her phone and dialed Earl's number. When he answered, his voice was gruff but alert. "You okay, kid?" "I found her," Melissa said, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. "I found Mom's story, and I think I know who they are." Earl didn't ask questions. Instead, he offered two simple words: "Tell me." As Melissa recounted what she'd discovered in the storage locker, she failed to notice the black sedan idling across the street. Its tinted windows reflected the late afternoon sun, hiding the driver's face, but not their intent. Whoever was behind this mystery had followed her to Duluth, and they weren't going to let her walk away with the truth. Melissa sat cross-legged on the floor of her motel room, surrounded by the contents of the storage locker. The journals, photos, and mementos formed a mosaic of her mother's hidden life, a life lived in shadows but filled with quiet determination. As she read through Claire's entries, fragments of her mother's story came into focus, painting a picture of resilience and love that Melissa had never fully understood. Claire's transformation from Claire Simmons to Clara Whitaker was painstakingly documented in her journals. Each entry revealed not just her struggles, but also her small victories, the moments of peace she managed to carve out for herself despite the constant fear of discovery. November 22nd, 2010. Today marks 1 year since I started working at Mabel's Diner. Ruth says I've got a knack for remembering orders without writing them down. It feels good to be useful again, even if it's just pouring coffee and flipping pancakes. The customers are kind, most of them anyway, and they don't ask too many questions. For now, that's enough. Melissa smiled faintly at the thought of her mother finding solace in something as simple as serving breakfast. Claire had always loved cooking. It made sense that she'd gravitate toward a job where she could create warmth for others, even when her own life felt cold and uncertain. As time went on, Claire began volunteering at the local library, shelving books and helping patrons find what they needed. Her love of reading had been passed down to Melissa, who remembered countless nights curled up beside her mother, while Claire read aloud from classic novels or fairy tales. April 15th, 2011. The library is my sanctuary. Between the stacks, I can almost forget who I am, or rather who I used to be. The librarian, Mrs. Hargrove, thinks I'm running from a bad marriage. She doesn't know how close she is to the truth. Sometimes I imagine bringing Melissa here to show her all the books I've discovered, all the stories I wish I could share with her. But I can't risk it. Not yet. Melissa closed her eyes, imagining Claire walking quietly between the shelves, her hands brushing against spines worn soft with use. In those moments, her mother must have felt free, even if only briefly. Despite the distance, Claire never stopped dreaming of reuniting with her children. Her journals were filled with musings about their lives, how Melissa might be excelling in school, how Jake would surely grow into a kind young man. She wrote letters to them regularly, though she never mailed them, knowing it was safer to keep her words locked away. December 25th, 2012. Merry Christmas, my sweet Melissa and Jake. I hope you're happy today, surrounded by laughter and love. I think about you every single day, in the quiet mornings before sunrise and the late nights when sleep won't come. Do you ever wonder where I am? Do you still believe I'll come back? One day, I promise, we'll be together again, when it's safe. Until then, please forgive me for staying away. Know that no matter how far apart we are, you're always in my heart. Melissa pressed the journal to her chest, tears streaming down her face. For so long, she'd believed her mother didn't care, that leaving was easier than staying. Now she saw the truth. Claire's absence wasn't abandonment, it was sacrifice. Even as Claire built a new life, the specter of danger loomed large over her. Every knock on the door, every unfamiliar face in town, sent her spiraling back into fear. Her journals chronicled these moments of paranoia, each one more harrowing than the last. March 9th, 2013. A man came into the diner today, asking questions about Clara Whitaker. Said he was an old friend looking to reconnect. Ruth told him I'd quit months ago, which isn't true, but it bought me some time. Still, I can't shake the feeling that he knows, that somehow they found me. I can't let them take me, not while Melissa and Jake are still out there. If anything happens to me, I've left instructions with Ruth. She'll make sure they get my letters, my photos, everything I've saved for them. Please, God, let them understand why I did this. Melissa's stomach churned as she read these words. Whoever they weren't ordinary people. They had resources, connections, and a reason to hunt Claire down. The pieces were starting to fit together, but gaps remained. Who exactly were they? Why had Dan lied about Claire's disappearance? And why had someone gone to such lengths to ensure Melissa uncovered her mother's trail now, 15 years later? Her phone buzzed suddenly, pulling her from her thoughts. Earl's name flashed across the screen. She answered quickly, her voice tense. Earl, I need your help. What's wrong? He asked, his tone sharp. I think whoever's been watching me followed me to Duluth, she said, glancing nervously at the curtains. And I think they're connected to whatever drove Mom into hiding. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then Earl spoke, his voice grim but resolute. Stay put. I'm coming to you. We'll figure this out together. Melissa's mind drifted back to fragmented memories of her father. His anger, his silence, the way he avoided talking about Claire after she disappeared. Had he known about the abuse, about the threats, or had he been complicit in some way? She remembered one argument vividly, though she hadn't understood it at the time. Claire pleading with Dan, her voice trembling. You don't get to control us anymore. Control. That was the key. Whoever they were, they thrived on power, and Claire had refused to bow to it. As Melissa waited for Earl to arrive, she noticed headlights sweeping past the motel window. The car slowed, then stopped directly outside her room. Her breath caught as the engine cut off, plunging the world into eerie silence. Whoever it was, they weren't leaving, not until they got what they came for. Melissa's hands trembled as she reached for the last journal in the stack. Its cover was worn, its pages thinner than the others, evidence of frequent handling. This one felt different, heavier somehow, as though it carried the weight of everything Claire had left unsaid. She opened it carefully, her breath catching when she saw the date on the final entry. 2015, 3 years after the photo at Lakeview Park, 2 years after the last trace Melissa had found of her mother's life as Clara Whitaker. The handwriting was fainter now, less steady, but unmistakably Claire's. Her heart pounding, Melissa began to read. March 17th, 2015. To my dearest Melissa and Jake, if you're reading this, it means I'm gone. Not just from your lives, but from this world. The doctors say I don't have much time left. Cancer, they call it. A cruel twist of fate, isn't it? After all the years I spent running, hiding, fighting to stay alive, in the end, my body betrayed me first. I wanted so badly to come back to you, my darlings, to hold you close, to tell you how proud I am of the people you've become. But I couldn't risk it, not while they were still out there. Every time I thought about returning, about breaking the silence I'd worked so hard to maintain, fear stopped me. Fear that I'd put you in danger. Fear that my love for you would be the thing that hurt you most. Please forgive me for leaving, for staying away, for not being strong enough to protect you the way a mother should. Know this, no matter where I am or where I've been, you are my greatest joy, my proudest achievement, my eternal love. I'll always watch over you, even if you can't see me. Take care of each other, be brave, and never forget how much you mean to me. With all my heart, Mom. Melissa's vision blurred as tears spilled onto the page, smudging the ink slightly. She clutched the journal to her chest, rocking back and forth as sobs racked her body. For 15 years, she'd believed her mother abandoned them willingly. Now she understood the depth of Claire's sacrifice, the impossible choice between staying safe and coming home. Her mother hadn't walked away because she didn't care. She'd stayed away because she loved them too much to endanger their lives. Memories flooded Melissa's mind, unbidden and raw. The birthday party Claire missed. The nights Melissa cried herself to sleep, longing for her mother's embrace. The unanswered questions, the guilt she'd carried for years, that maybe somehow she hadn't been good enough to keep Claire around. But through it all, Claire had been fighting for survival, for freedom, for her family. Even as her health failed, even as death loomed closer, she'd held on to hope that someday her children would understand why she did what she did. As Melissa sat amidst the remnants of her mother's hidden life, she felt a strange sense of peace settle over her. The anger and confusion that had driven her investigation were replaced by something else: acceptance. Claire's story wasn't one of abandonment. It was one of courage, resilience, and unconditional love. Still, questions lingered. Who were they? What had Claire been running from? And why had someone chosen now, 15 years later, to lead Melissa to these answers? Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock at the door. Earl stood outside, his expression grave but kind. Behind him, the black sedan was nowhere to be seen, at least for now. "You okay?" he asked gently, stepping inside and closing the door behind him. Melissa shook her head, holding up the journal. She died in 2015, in a hospice center, alone. Earl sighed heavily, sinking into a chair across from her. "I'm sorry, kid. That's brutal." "She gave up everything," Melissa whispered, her voice cracking. "For us. For me." Earl nodded slowly, his eyes reflecting the same mix of sorrow and determination Melissa felt burning inside her. "Then we owe it to her to finish this, to find out who they are, and make sure they can't hurt anyone else." Together, Melissa and Earl sifted through the remaining contents of the storage locker, searching for any clue that might point them toward the people threatening Claire's family. Among the items they found, a crumpled receipt from a private investigator Claire had hired in 2010, a newspaper clipping about a corruption scandal involving local officials in their hometown, a Polaroid photo of Dan meeting with two men in suits, taken from a distance. The caption on the back read, "They know." Melissa stared at the photo, her stomach twisting. Whatever secrets Dan had kept, whatever deals he'd made, they were tied directly to the people Claire feared. "I think we need to talk to your dad," Earl said quietly, watching her reaction. "He's dead," Melissa replied, her voice hollow. "Died 5 years ago. Stroke." Earl frowned, rubbing a hand over his stubbled chin. "Then whoever he was working with is still out there, and they're not done yet." As Melissa packed up the journals and mementos preparing to leave Duluth, her phone buzzed again. Another text from the unknown number appeared on the screen. "You found her secret. Now it's your turn to disappear." Outside, the sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway, slowly, deliberately, moving closer to her door. Whoever they were, they weren't going to let Melissa walk away, not without a fight. The weight of her mother's final journal entry settled over Melissa like a suffocating blanket. Claire hadn't just disappeared. She'd spent years fighting to stay alive, only to succumb to an illness that left her isolated and alone. The thought of her mother taking her last breath in a hospice center, miles away from the family she loved so fiercely, broke something deep inside Melissa. But grief wasn't enough. Not yet. She needed closure. She needed to find where Claire had been laid to rest. Using the name Clara Whitaker and the dates mentioned in Claire's journals, Melissa and Earl began their search. It wasn't easy. Claire had gone to great lengths to erase her old identity, leaving behind no traceable records under her real name. But eventually they discovered a small hospice center in northern Minnesota, nestled among dense pine forests and quiet lakes. The staff remembered Clara well, A kind woman who kept to herself, but always greeted everyone with a warm smile. They spoke of her courage during treatment and her quiet resignation when it became clear there was nothing more they could do. She never mentioned family, one nurse recalled sadly, just said she hoped someone would understand someday. When asked about burial arrangements, the administrator hesitated before pulling out a file. She paid for everything in advance, requested a simple service, no headstone, just peace. Melissa felt a lump rise in her throat as she read the details. Claire had chosen anonymity even in death, unwilling or unable to reconnect with her past. Her unmarked grave was located in a modest cemetery on the outskirts of town, its location recorded only in the hospice's private records. The next morning, Melissa stood at the edge of the cemetery, her heart heavy as she scanned the rows of weathered stones. Earl waited by the car, giving her space to grieve in private. This moment belonged to her and to Claire. Finally, she found it, a patch of earth marked only by freshly turned soil and a small wooden stake bearing the number 27. No name, no epitaph, just emptiness. Melissa sank to her knees, tears streaming down her face as she pressed her palms against the cool ground. For 15 years, she'd imagined every possible scenario. Her mother running away, starting a new life, forgetting them. But this was unbearable. "I'm here, Mom," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I finally found you." She reached into her bag and pulled out the photograph of Claire laughing at the park, the one dated 2012, and placed it gently on the grave. Beneath it, she laid the wedding ring Earl had recovered from the thrift shop, its tiny diamonds catching the sunlight. "I'll make sure you're not forgotten," Melissa promised, her voice breaking. "I'll tell Jake. I'll tell everyone. You didn't leave because you didn't care. You left because you loved us too much." For several minutes, she stayed there, letting the silence envelop her. Then slowly, she stood and stepped back, brushing dirt from her jeans. As painful as this moment was, it brought clarity. Claire's story wasn't over. It lived on through her children, through the love she'd sacrificed everything to protect. Back at the motel, Melissa pored over the remaining clues Claire had left behind. The newspaper clipping about the corruption scandal caught her attention again. It detailed allegations of bribery and blackmail involving local officials in their hometown, including Dan Simmons' name. Her father hadn't just been emotionally abusive, he'd been entangled in something far darker. Whatever secrets he'd kept had put Claire, and possibly their entire family, in danger. Earl noticed her focused expression and leaned closer. "What is it?" "This," Melissa said, tapping the article. "It's connected. Dad. He must have owed them money or favors. That's why Mom was scared. Why she ran." Earl nodded grimly. "If we dig deeper into this scandal, we might find out who they are and why they're still after you." Melissa's mind drifted to fragmented memories of her childhood, the arguments between her parents, the tension that filled their home. Claire whispering, "It's complicated, sweetheart." Dan pacing angrily in the driveway while neighbors watched curiously. Had Dan known Claire was being threatened, or had he been complicit in silencing her? As Melissa and Earl discussed their next steps, her phone buzzed once more. Another text from the unknown number appeared on the screen. "You can't hide what's already buried. Stop digging, or end up like her." This time, there was an attachment. A grainy photo of Melissa standing beside Claire's unmarked grave, taken earlier that day. Someone had followed her, even here. Her blood ran cold as she showed the message to Earl. He cursed under his breath, grabbing his coat. "We need to move. Now." Outside, the black sedan idled near the parking lot, its engine rumbling ominously. Two figures sat inside, their faces obscured by tinted windows. As Melissa and Earl hurried toward their car, the sedan revved to life, pulling onto the road behind them. Whoever they were, they weren't going to let Melissa uncover the truth without a fight. With the sedan closing in, Melissa glanced at Earl, panic rising in her chest. "What do we do now?" Earl gripped the steering wheel tightly, his jaw clenched. "We run, and we figure out how to take them down before they take us." The confrontation had been brewing since the moment Melissa uncovered her father's name in the corruption scandal. Every revelation about Claire's life, her fears, her sacrifices, her ultimate fate, pointed back to Dan. He wasn't just a broken man burdened by guilt. He was complicit in the web of lies that drove Claire into hiding. Though Dan had passed away years ago, Melissa couldn't escape the need for answers. She returned home to their old house, where memories lingered like ghosts in every creaking floorboard and dusty corner. Armed with Claire's journals, the newspaper clipping about the scandal, and the photo of Dan meeting with the mysterious men in suits, she sat at the dining room table and prepared herself for what felt like the final piece of this puzzle. She opened her laptop, pulling up old voicemails and letters Dan had left behind after his death. His voice echoed through the speakers as she hit play. One message in particular stood out, recorded months before his stroke. "Melissa, sweetheart, I know I haven't always been the dad you deserved. There are things I should have told you about your mom, about me, but I'm scared you'll hate me when you find out the truth. Just know this, I loved her. I love both of you more than anything. And if I could go back and fix it all, I would." Tears welled in Melissa's eyes, but anger burned hotter beneath them. Love wasn't an excuse. Not anymore. Melissa remembered how Dan used to sit at this very table late at night, nursing glass after glass of whiskey while staring blankly at the wall. She'd asked him once why he never talked about Claire. His response had been sharp, almost offensive. "Some things are better left buried, Mel." Now she understood what he meant, but not in the way he intended. When Earl arrived carrying photocopies of financial records linking Dan to payouts from the corrupt officials, Melissa laid everything out on the table. It was overwhelming. The journals detailing Claire's abuse, the photos of Dan with shadowy figures, the receipts showing payments made under false pretenses. All signs pointed to one conclusion. Dan hadn't just failed Claire emotionally, he'd enabled the people who threatened her. But there was no one left to confront directly, only memories and unanswered questions. Still, Melissa needed closure. She decided to visit Dan's grave, determined to face him even in death. Dan's headstone was simple, bearing only his name, birth date, and the year he died. Melissa knelt beside it, clutching Claire's journal tightly in her hands. For a long moment, she said nothing, letting the wind rustle through the trees overhead. Then finally she spoke. "You lied to us," she began, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. "You let Mom suffer. You let her think she had no choice but to run, to leave us behind." Her throat tightened as tears spilled down her cheeks. "I found her, Dad. I know what really happened. I know about the money, the deals, the threats. Did you even care? Or were we just pawns in whatever game you were playing?" She paused, imagining his gruff voice responding, as it often did in her memories. "It's complicated, Mel." "No," she snapped, her tone sharper now. "It's not complicated. You chose fear over family, control over love, and because of that, Mom spent 15 years living in shadows, dying alone without ever seeing us again." Her words hung heavy in the air, echoing off the stones around her. But as much as she wanted to hate him, part of her couldn't. Not entirely, because deep down, she knew Dan hadn't set out to destroy his family. He'd simply been too weak, too flawed, to stop himself from doing so anyway. As Melissa flipped through the pages of Claire's journal, searching for something, anything that might explain Dan's actions, she stumbled upon an entry she hadn't noticed before. April 10th, 2009. "Today, Dan cried, actually cried, said he didn't know how to fix things between us, that he felt trapped in a life he couldn't control. I wanted to believe him, to forgive him, but forgiveness doesn't erase the damage, doesn't make the bruises disappear or quiet the voices in my head telling me to leave." Melissa stared at the words, her chest tightening. Her father hadn't been innocent. He'd been broken, a victim of his own choices, trapped in a cycle of guilt and regret. And yet, he'd still loved them, in his own twisted, imperfect way. Back at the house, Melissa sat cross-legged on the living room floor, surrounded by Claire's belongings. Earl joined her, sensing the shift in her demeanor. Gone was the fiery determination to expose Dan's flaws. In its place was a quiet resolve. "He wasn't evil," Melissa said softly, tracing the edge of one of Claire's photographs. Just human, flawed, weak. Earl nodded slowly. People do bad things for lots of reasons, kid. That doesn't mean they don't love their families. Your dad made mistakes, big ones, but hating him won't bring your mom back. Melissa exhaled shakily, nodding in agreement. Hating Dan wouldn't change the past, but understanding his role in it might help her move forward. Claire's story wasn't just about survival or sacrifice. It was about breaking free from cycles of pain and finding strength in the face of fear. I want to honor her, Melissa said firmly, her voice steadying, not just by remembering her, but by making sure no one else has to live like she did, alone, afraid. Earl smiled faintly, placing a hand on her shoulder. Then let's finish this, together. As Melissa packed up Claire's journals and mementos, preparing to take them home, her phone buzzed once more. Another text from the unknown number appeared on the screen. You can't rewrite history, Melissa. Some secrets are meant to stay buried. But this time, instead of fear, Melissa felt defiance rising within her. Whoever they were, they underestimated her determination. She wasn't running anymore, and neither was Claire's legacy. Melissa knew she couldn't carry this burden alone. Not anymore. For years, her siblings had shared the same pain, the same unanswered questions about their mother's disappearance. It was time to share the truth, not just for herself, but for all of them. She called Jake first. Her younger brother lived 3 states away, working as a mechanic and raising 2 kids of his own. When he answered the phone, his voice was wary. He hadn't heard from Melissa in months, and her tone gave him pause. "Jake," she began, her voice trembling slightly despite her resolve. "I found Mom." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Then cautiously, "What do you mean?" "I mean, I know what happened to her, where she went, why she left." Melissa took a deep breath, steadying herself. "You need to come home. We all do." By the time Jake arrived, along with their older sister Emma, who had moved out of state after high school, they were all gathered around the dining room table where so many memories had unfolded. Melissa spread out Claire's journals, photographs, and mementos, explaining everything she'd uncovered over the past few weeks. At first, they struggled to process it. Jake sat stiffly, arms crossed, his jaw clenched tightly. Emma stared at the items on the table, tears streaming silently down her face. Neither could reconcile the image of Claire as someone who abandoned them with the reality that emerged from the journals, that she had sacrificed everything to keep them safe. "She didn't leave because she didn't care," Melissa said firmly, her voice breaking slightly. "She left because she loved us too much to risk losing us forever." For Jake, anger came first. He paced the room, shaking his head. How could she stay away, knowing how much we needed her? How hard it was without her? Emma reached for one of the journals, flipping through its pages. Her hands trembled as she read Claire's words aloud. "I wanted so badly to come back to you, my darlings, but I couldn't risk it. Not while they were still out there." Her voice cracked and she set the journal down, covering her mouth with her hand. "She was scared," Emma whispered. "Scared for us." Jake stopped pacing, sinking into a chair. His anger softened into something else. Grief, maybe, or guilt. "Why didn't she tell us?" he asked quietly. "Why didn't she trust us enough to explain?" Melissa sighed, running a hand through her hair. "Because she thought protecting us meant keeping us in the dark. She believed staying away was the only way to keep us safe." Memories flooded the room as they spoke. Fragments of childhood pieced together like shards of glass. Emma remembered baking cookies with Claire, laughing as flour dusted their noses. Jake recalled bedtime stories and warm hugs after nightmares. Melissa thought of lazy summer afternoons spent fishing by the lake, Claire teaching her how to cast a line. But alongside those happy moments were darker ones, the arguments between their parents, the tension that filled the house like smoke. None of them had understood the full extent of Dan's abuse or Claire's fear until now. As the hours passed, the weight of the truth settled over them. They cried together, sharing memories of Claire and the pain of her absence. Slowly, tentatively, they began to rebuild their image of her. Not as someone who abandoned them, but as a woman who fought fiercely for her family, even when it cost her everything. "We have to honor her," Emma said finally, her voice steady despite the tears in her eyes. "Not just by remembering her, but by making sure no one else has to live like she did." Jake nodded, rubbing his temples. "Yeah, but how do we do that? How do we fix something this broken?" Melissa leaned forward, determination blazing in her eyes. "We expose the truth about Mom, about Dad, about whoever they are. We make sure people know what really happened." With her siblings beside her, Melissa felt a renewed sense of purpose. Whatever secrets remained buried, whatever threats loomed ahead, they would face them together. Claire's legacy wasn't just one of sacrifice, it was also one of resilience and love, and it was up to them to carry that forward. The next morning, they returned to the cemetery where Claire's unmarked grave lay. This time, they brought flowers, wildflowers picked from fields near the lake, just like the ones Claire used to gather when they were kids. Emma knelt beside the grave, placing the bouquet gently on the ground. "We know now, Mom," she said softly. "We know why you did what you did, and we forgive you." Jake stood silently, his fists clenched at his sides. After a moment, he stepped forward and placed a small toy car on the grave, a relic from his childhood that Claire had once given him. "I miss you," he murmured, his voice barely audible. Melissa added the photograph of Claire laughing at the park, along with the wedding ring they'd recovered from the thrift shop. "You'll never be forgotten," she promised. "Not again." As they turned to leave, a black sedan pulled into the cemetery parking lot, idling quietly beneath the shade of an oak tree. Two figures stepped out, their faces obscured by sunglasses and hats. One of them held a folded piece of paper, which they placed carefully on the hood of the car before driving away. Melissa approached cautiously, her heart pounding as she unfolded the note. Written in bold letters across the page were 4 words: "You can't stop us." Whoever they weren't done yet, and neither was Melissa. The morning dawned crisp and clear, the kind of day that felt like a fresh start. Melissa stood at the edge of the cemetery with her siblings, holding a young sapling in her arms. It was a maple tree, strong, resilient, and vibrant, just like the woman they were honoring today. They had chosen this spot carefully, planting the tree near Claire's unmarked grave as a living monument to her memory. A plaque etched with her name would be added later, but for now, the act of planting itself carried profound meaning. This wasn't just about marking where she rested. It was about giving her life new roots, allowing her love to grow and flourish long after she was gone. Melissa knelt beside the freshly dug earth, her hands trembling slightly as she prepared to place the sapling into the ground. Beside her, Jake held a shovel, ready to help fill in the soil, while Emma clutched an envelope containing one of Claire's final letters, one Melissa had saved specifically for this moment. As the tree settled into its new home, Melissa opened the envelope and unfolded the letter inside. Her voice wavered as she began to read aloud, each word carrying the weight of 15 years of longing, loss, and love. "My dearest Melissa, Daniel, and Sarah, please know I left because I loved you too much to stay. Every decision I made, every sacrifice I endured, was for your safety, for your future. I wanted so badly to hold you close, to watch you grow into the incredible people I knew you'd become. But fear kept me away. Fear of what might happen if I return. One day I hope you'll understand. Please don't let my absence define you. Instead, let it remind you of how precious life is. Be brave when the world feels dark. Be kind even when it's hard. And live fully for both of us. No matter where I am, I'll always be with you, watching over you, loving you. Forever and always, Mom." Tears streamed down Melissa's face as she finished reading, her voice breaking on the final words. Jake wiped his eyes roughly with the back of his hand, while Emma hugged herself tightly, rocking back and forth as sobs racked her body. For so long, they had carried the weight of their mother's absence without understanding why. Now hearing her voice again, even through a letter written years ago, brought a bittersweet sense of peace. Together, they filled in the soil around the base of the tree, patting it gently until the sapling stood firm and steady. Melissa placed the letter beneath the roots, tucking it safely into the earth where it could remain forever. As sunlight filtered through the surrounding trees, casting dappled patterns across the ground, a single beam illuminated the young maple, bathing it in golden light. "It's beautiful," Emma whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "Just like her." Jake nodded, resting a hand on the trunk of the tree. "She'd have liked this. Something alive. Growing." Melissa smiled faintly, brushing dirt from her palms. "It's not just a memorial," she said softly. "It's a promise. To keep going. To honor her by living the way she wanted us to." For the first time in years, Melissa felt a glimmer of hope. Not just for herself, but for her family. Claire's story hadn't ended with her death. It lived on through them. Her courage, her resilience, her unconditional love. They were woven into the fabric of who Melissa, Jake, and Emma had become. And though the scars of the past would never fully heal, they no longer defined them. As they stepped back to admire the newly planted tree, sunlight streaming through its delicate leaves, Melissa felt a quiet certainty settle over her. They had faced the truth, confronted their pain, and found a way to move forward together. Claire may have been gone, but her legacy remained, a testament to the power of love, sacrifice, and renewal.